the swag on. Get the swag on.
Bonsoir à tous. Hello, good evening. Welcome to the family. I'm sorry for my accent. It's going to be in English tonight because we have two super cool, great foreigners coming tonight. So it's going to be great because actually they speak proper English. But to respect them and so they can understand also who we are and why we are all gathered here tonight, I'm going to do this short introduction in English. So, good evening. My name is Alice. I'm the CEO of The Family. And The Family is this building where you are tonight. And just to give you the big pictures of who we are and what we do, we are actually a startup accelerator. A startup accelerator, it's like a school for entrepreneurs, okay? So every day here at The Family, we welcome more than 106 startups who come to take some lessons, to take methodology, tools, feedback, and to help them grow fast internationally. And to do so, you know, with all my team, we want to really connect them with different types of community. And we've decided to start some meetups, like this one tonight, which is Get the Swag On, which is an open meetup. And why did we decide to start Get the Swag On? Because, you know, the main problem of our startups in France is that we have super crazy, great, very good, very smart tech engineers, and they design very complex interface, but never they have the swag. Never they are user-friendly. Never they really take into account the usage. So we needed to address more artists, more designers, more creatives, and to mix with these people so our engineers could actually meet you guys, because I know that most of you tonight are designers. So the main purpose of tonight is to give you on stage two beautiful testimonials from great designers from all over the world. So we really, with Hugo, you know, we attack them on Twitter, we invite them, we say, you have to come to Paris, you have to meet with our ecosystem, you have to meet with our startup, our designers, and share your knowledge, share your experience. So this is the main purpose of Get the Swag On. So we hope that you will help our startups to get the swag on, okay? Get the swag on is possible because we have super great partners who support us, and they are Amazon, Microsoft, PayPal, and some schools like IESA Multimedia. Maybe you have some students from there tonight. Strat College and the Geek School 42. All right, I think that's all for me. So you're gonna have two great testimonials tonight. I'm gonna let Hugo introduce them. After this intervention, you'll be able to enjoy this area. You'll be able to enjoy the bar, and I want you to connect together. Okay? Here you are in a very cool space. We want you to talk to each other, even if you don't know each other. So really break the ice, talk together, create some new initiatives, mix with each other. That's the main purpose of tonight. Okay? Thank you. Hugo, who do we have tonight? Who did you attack on Twitter?
First, sorry for my English. I have two excuses. I'm French and I'm sick, so that I'm okay with that. So we have two designers, two people from the United States, one from New York, the other one from Miami originally, but now in London. First, Michael is creative director at Frog Design. It's an amazing agency, a design agency, and he's gonna talk about designing in connected machine environment. So it's gonna be really interesting. Don't forget that you have the presentation, but you can talk to them if you have any question that you don't want to ask in front of all the audience after the talk. So please feel free to come and ask them those questions. So that's the first talk. And the second talk it's Dan is over there and he's shy and he's going to come up after. Dan is a former creative director at Moo.com. I'm sure you have already printed cards at Moo. He was part of it. And now is a UX designer. He's consulting for a lot of startups in New York as well. And he's also a super cool photographer because he has like more than 700,000 followers on Instagram. So it's quite impressive. So that gets him to travel all around the world to actually take photographs and get paid to do that. So that's super cool. And he's gonna tell. He has a great talk title. The talk title is "We Are All Product Designers." So we love that because you can understand it as much as I can. So thank you very much for all showing up here. I think that's the most successful Get the Swag On meetup that we have ever had. So I think we're on a great path here. And now I'm going to welcome Michael for the first talk. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thanks for having me, first of all, Hugo, Alice, and everybody at the family. What you guys have going on here is pretty awesome, and thanks for joining me. So let's see. I work at a company called Frog, and we are a global product strategy and design firm. And I've been giving a talk similar to this that I've tailored for you guys tonight about how we as designers can ultimately understand from the user's perspective how to make better connected products. Okay, so as we've been putting more sensors and putting more connectivity into products and connecting these things, whether that's a digital product or a physical product, we've been seeing a lot of superfluous use of why you would want to do that. And so I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about how to put a more human perspective on connectivity and connected products. So for those of you guys who don't know Frog, Frog is a global product strategy and design firm. We started actually in Germany in the late 70s, and this is our founder over here. And he moved to San Francisco to work for Steve Jobs to do industrial design on some of the first Apple computers. So that's really where our legacy came from. And we've always had a tight-knit coupling between technology and product design. So he was thinking about how can we not only design this as a shell and as a physical device, but also how can we create an emotional connection to these objects. Right? So it's not just about the object plus technology, it's about the object plus technology and creating an emotional connection to that actual object, that product. These days, we do a lot of digital work. We still do product work, and we still do a lot of products that have digital components, and we call that convergent design, right? So we're looking at products where there's a convergence between technology and product design. And again, I'm here to talk about how we can put a human perspective onto that design. So from a service offering, we focus on 4 things. 1, growth strategy. The second one, experience strategy. Product and service design, which is a little bit more fundamental design services. And also product realization, which is bringing those things to life. I'm going to talk more about experience strategy tonight because that's really where you get that connection between the end user, time, and some of those more emotional connections, as I mentioned. We're a global studio, right? So we're pretty big. We have a big reach. We're all over the place. More specifically, something that's interesting that I think that we're doing in the startup space is a project or a new arm of Frog called Frog Ventures. And so we realized that we were doing really cool work for a lot of big companies, but we wanted to be able to work with startups and also bring that world-class design to smaller players in the market. So something that we started about 6 months ago is this idea called Frog Ventures. So we've actually structured a way for us as a design firm to do cash equity deals with smaller firms who may not have been able to afford our services. And so far it's been going great. We've had a huge interest in that space. A lot of the projects have been run out of our San Francisco studio, where we've been able to work with companies to deliver design, but not do it just as a service, also actually have some skin in the game so that we can work it like a regular equity deal. So me personally, I have my roots in interaction design. Right? I grew up doing all digital design. And I studied connected hardware at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program, so it's ITP. And at NYU, we were doing hardware hacking, right? We were trying to build connected products kind of as that trend was emerging. We were starting to do some social software, right before Facebook was starting to get big. I went to a bunch of different startups, actually. One of them that is still around and highly profitable is Roomorama. It's an Airbnb competitor. They do great services. It's very similar. They're kind of in the same space, but they didn't take equity, so they couldn't grow as fast, which has been an interesting experience to learn from. Then I went over to Frog, where I'm now a creative director. So designing for connectivity. How many people here have heard of one of these terms? Or even better yet, what's the French word for this? So there's a lot of these terms, right? Internet of Things, Industrial Internet. The names don't really matter. There's a lot of overlap, and depending on who you're talking to, you will hear a different slant on what it is. The Internet of Things tends to be the most popular. One thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit later is the industrial internet, just because I've been doing a lot of work for GE, and they've kind of carved out a little space in the Internet of Things that specifically focuses on connected infrastructure. So how you can connect large-scale products, things like locomotives, airplane engines, and have that data be transmitted to somebody who needs to use that data as a service, and then improve the product or the efficiency of that large-scale thing. But I think that it's important to keep perspective. And this was Red Burns. She was actually the founder of ITP, and she was notoriously famous by saying, by the time you define a movement, it's already over. So everybody's trying to kind of put a label on it, but as soon as you can do that, and as soon as you can clearly label something, it's already done. Like, the interesting part of that is already over. And so to me, when I look at all these things, I'm like, that's great. Like, we don't actually know where we are, and we're still trying to figure that out. And so to me, we're actually, in a cool place. So great products are more than the sum of their parts, and this is really true. So there's this idea that you can throw more sensors into a product, you can put more developers on a team, you can write more code, and that will somehow inherently make the product better. And that's simply not true at all. Because you're dealing with humans, right? And humans are weird. We are, right? Like, if you look at this photo that this gentleman took over here a while ago, which is actually in Paris, we're emotional, right? But there's like a photographer, and there's somebody else queuing up a different camera with light, and then there's another photographer taking this picture. There's this other guy over here. It really makes no logical sense as to like what these humans are doing. And at the end of the day, we're emotional, right? We don't make decisions purely based on the most rational thing going on. And so when we think about how to structure an approach then to product design, we get back to this idea of experience strategy. And experience strategy is this idea that people have a relationship with the product that exists over time, and they have freedom, right? They have this immense sense of freedom to move in and out of that product space, or have a relationship with that brand through a series of products or websites or mobile devices or physical things that changes over time. And it's supported by this notion of design research. So design research is a series of activities that we can use to better understand, from the user's perspective, how they perceive the product, and really get into their mind space so that we can improve the product, improve the approach, and make it better. So we come to this. This is the Disney Magic Band. This is an RFID bracelet, right? That Disney has been rolling out in the theme parks that Frog worked on. And so when we think about experience strategy, right, you're not actually designing this, right? We're not designing the product. Well, this does have a design, right? We're not actually making the physical product. What we're making is this, right? This is actually what we're designing, right? You're designing that moment, that emotional connection where the girl has the band, right? And she's at the theme park, and she's using it, And maybe the person at Disney knows something about what other rides she's been to, or she's been able to skip the line. But it's the experience, right? It's not the actual physical thing that starts to matter as much as it does when you're trying to create that one emotional connection to the actual thing. And so I'll give you a couple other examples. When we think about experience strategy and how this relates to the array of ways in which people visit your product or service, right? We have the Magic Band, but then it also ties to a website. It also ties to a mobile device. In the parks, we also designed the signage, right? So that you could pre-order food, you could go to the ride and not wait in line. But it becomes this system of connected parts. And it's not so much about designing the physical thing or the graphics on the band. It becomes more about how do you choreograph, again, that person's relationship to those products over time, right? So it becomes more of a time-based situation that you're dealing with. And what this really starts to do, and this was from the New York Times last year, and you can read the quote yourself, but the basic idea is that it's an arms race if everybody's just building rides and building different rides based on different themes. But that's really not going to give you a business advantage. So if you can look at those experiences and think about how you can pivot in order to have more value in those experiences, you can really start to gain a competitive advantage against somebody else who's building a theme park next door. So another framework that we can use to begin to think about these things is this idea of immediate convenience, aggregated benefit, and latent value. So I'm sure that there's a similar system in France. In the United States and around the New York area, we have this thing called E-ZPass. And the basic notion of E-ZPass is that you have it in your car. It's an RFID system in your car, and then you go through the tollway, and it charges back to your credit card, right? And so when we start to look at that, there's this notion of an immediate convenience for me that I can then go through the tollway faster and not have to have coins on me. There's aggregated benefits because they can then start to use that information for traffic. Google does this with your phone when you're checking maps. The RFID systems in E-ZPass also relay that to anonymized traffic data so that they can have better traffic information throughout the city and around the tollways. And then the interesting thing that starts to happen is so you have the personal advantage that you gain from the connected system. You have the aggregated, so more of the communal benefit. But then you also have the long-term benefit. And so there was a study done in New Jersey that when they implemented the E-ZPass system around the tollways to reduce congestion, it actually benefited birth rates. And so we can see that there's a personal advantage from the connected system. There's the communal advantage if you're aggregating the data. And then again, over time, you can only see that advantage if you start to look at how it's impacting the community on the long scale. And so there's the latent value. And so when we're thinking about connected products, right, we really need to think about these things in a new way. And so this is one of the frameworks that we begin to think about connected products in, and specifically where we can see the opportunity when we're thinking about a product. And so if we look here, right, there's the immediate, aggregate, and latent framework that I just mentioned. Then on the left-hand side, we've got data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. So if the idea is that a connected product can actually transmit data to a remote source, you would think that over time, right, you would get better information, you'd actually gain knowledge, right, and eventually you'd create a higher level of knowledge, which would be wisdom, right? So in the E-ZPass example, the data coming off of there would just be simply the number of people who went through. The information and the knowledge starts to build towards the traffic, and you also have wisdom. And so getting the data is relatively easy. And that's why, from my perspective, there's a lot of people trying to make, connected everything these days, right? But the hard part is actually trying to get people to understand that there's wisdom and ultimately knowledge that can be gained from these things. And so my personal approach is to try to find opportunity in this space, right? Is to try to look here in terms of where to go after. And if you can't identify these three things in order to move down on the framework, it's really going to be tough, right? Because the data across there isn't really providing much for the consumer. So keeping the lights on. I mentioned earlier that I work at Frog. I've spent a lot of time, specifically in the last few years, working with GE. And you might think, what does GE have to do with startups? It's been interesting. Has anybody here read The Lean Startup, Eric Ries? Yeah? Some people have heard of it? Cool, some people. It's been amazing how much of an impact that book has made, not only in the startup community, but also in large corporate organizations. Companies like GE are actually starting to try to emulate that methodology and implement it to grow incubators inside the corporate culture, because they know that, and I've heard that you guys have been doing some of this, where you're trying to bring industries in that are being disrupted by startups to have a more open dialogue, because the startups can move faster than the big companies. They can pivot faster. They can make decisions faster. And so it's been really interesting when working with a big client like that and seeing that book make an impact and how they've had to change some of their corporate culture to deal with that. It's been a good thing, in my opinion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing with GE and how that's been impacted by connected systems. Nest is one of the seminal examples that is out there in terms of connectivity. It's a great example too. It's simple. They were acquired by Google recently. What it does, if you're not familiar with the product, is that it takes your own behavior as you adjust it. It learns when you turn the radiator on and off, so that I can learn from your behavior and so that you don't have to program it, right? It learns when you want it off, it learns when you want it on, and then it auto-adjusts and plans your calendar so that you don't have to program it. And in doing so, it finds better efficiencies for when you have the heat on and things like that. So connected value, as I mentioned earlier, it's really not about the actual product, right? When we look at something like Nest, it looks better than a lot of the radiators or the thermostats that you see, mostly in the US, kind of the dial ones. But again, it's not about the physical product. It is, but the person isn't going to find more value unless you can take the data that's coming from that connected device, do something with it and learn about their human behavior, and then change the behavior of the product on the other side. So when we look at something as simple as a light switch, right, it's a really basic thing. But for a company like GE, because they deal with industries on such a massive scale, the scale of things is just mind-boggling, right? Like $63 billion. If they can increase healthcare efficiencies by 1%, they're dealing with a massive amount of money. And so for them, moving the needle just a little bit on something like electricity is huge, because they're dealing with electrical grids, power plants, things that are really, really massive in scale. And so the design brief when we started working on this project was to combine legacy outage planning systems, which were controlling the electrical grid, into a single product offering. So through acquisitions, they had acquired a number of different smaller companies that were startups at one time that were actually doing smart planning on the energy grid, right? They were looking at how energy was distributed, if there was a storm and the lights went out, how it was actually being managed. We knew that we needed to talk to users and ultimately go out there and better understand from their perspective, how are they using the software, what were they doing, what were the guys in the field doing. When we deal with a company like this on such a big scale, there's guys in the field, right? There's people in the office. There's a huge range of products and services that go into managing something like that. But Frog as a company has a deep belief in user-centered design and approaching things from the customer's perspective to make sure that we understand what they find valuable in the products, so that in a problem like this, where we're being asked to consolidate a software service offering into a singular product, that we're not ditching the wrong thing just because an executive thinks that the last company that was acquired was the right one. And so why is this an industrial internet problem, or why is this a problem that has to do with connectivity? It's really because the future is affected by intelligence, right? And so one of the things that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about Nest and why that was a successful connected product is that there's a loop in the data that forms a relationship between the product, the analytics, and how that product is actually working in the future, right? And so in this example with connectivity and electricity, right? So we're working on a software system that helps manage electrical lines and power grids. Out in the world, these transmission stations and electrical transmission utility poles can actually be transmitting data about what's going on in that subsystem back to a remote location. They can also be controlled, right? So the power can actually be physically turned on and off through network switches by a remote operator. So what we knew that we needed to do was actually better understand how they were using these multiple systems in order to look at the product, right, in this case, which was the physical thing in the field, understand how they were using that data in order to make it smarter so that they could change how that thing was being used. And so from a research methodology perspective, we focused on 5 things. Stakeholder alignment, right? So not just thinking about what the users were doing, but also thinking about who the people who had acquired the software systems had done over time. So getting them all in a room and saying, okay, what is the first priority that we actually need to do here? Understanding some of the product demonstrations, so taking a look at what had been done in the product ecosystem so far. Contextual observation, and this is a huge one that we leverage quite often, which is simply the idea that you can't understand fully how a person's using a product or service without going into their environment and actually watching them and seeing what they do. And I can't stress this enough that a lot of people, when you work with different clients, right, they'll think that the stakeholders or the product owners know everything. When in actuality, when you go and you talk to the end users and you get into the research doing contextual observation, you find out that there's a workaround or that there's something wrong with the system that the stakeholders or the product owners don't actually know about. And so we leverage contextual observation really pretty heavily. Participatory design. And so this is simply the act of co-designing a product with an end user. And we have a number of different techniques that we use for participatory design as well. And I'll show you a few examples in a moment. And then a day in the life too, and this gets more back to some of the time-based things that I mentioned earlier, is that often it's not the case that the person is just using the product or the service in the moment when you're observing them in the field, but that there's other things that they're doing that lead up to that moment, right? You may receive a notification on your phone that gets you to do something later in the day, for example. So it's also about looking at how they're using that over time. So contextual inquiry, and this is a photo from one of the control rooms of a network grid. So in understanding environmental context, right? So actually getting in there and understanding what are they doing in the control room? How are they using these multi-monitor environments? This is actually another photo. So the product that we were working on in this case, it's a little bit hard to see back here, but there was 11 monitors in some of these situations where the person was using multiple mapping systems to manage the electrical grid. On the wall behind them, yeah, you guys can see it a little better over there. They're actually using tape to plot out how the electrical grid is being connected to different endpoints. You can see the ladder in the background over there, where when they would make a change, they would actually go and take a piece of tape and kind of change the relationship between, at least at the high level, the electrical grid. So there's all these things that you learn when you get into the environment of where the person's doing the work. And again, product demonstrations. And this was really interesting because here we could start to see interaction patterns with regards to how people were using the multi-windowed environment, how they were going through their day-to-day tasks and what they were actually doing. And this led to a unique product feature that I'll tell you about in a moment. Participatory design, I mentioned this one earlier. Here on the right-hand side, what you're looking at is an example of a user-generated dashboard. So what we would do is we would sit down with them with a blank piece of paper that kind of has a browser on it. And maybe we would have an idea of 5 pieces of functionality that the product owners were thinking about incorporating into the system. And what we do is have them create the dashboard that's ideally for them. And that doesn't mean that we necessarily go and build that, but then what you can look for is high-level patterns, right? So if you see that a number of users are consistently prioritizing something like a notification system or a map, you can then go back and say, look, we thought that the product should really incorporate a notification system, but at the end of the day, the maps were really important and they were prioritized really highly by the users that we talked to. So from there, after going through that research activity and talking to people in the field, we began to build user experience strategy. And that experience strategy had 4 pillars. One was magnifying awareness. So we heard from a lot of people who were managing this electrical grid that they needed to be aware not only of what was going on with the electrical system, but what was happening with crews in the field, so that we could have this heightened sense of awareness going forward. Standardizing data representation and visualization. So throughout the systems, there was different ways that maps were being represented, different ways that notification systems were being represented, and we knew that we had to bring a standard way to actually displaying that so that people could make sense of it and understand it. Simplifying alarms management. This is huge if you work on anything that's, again, on this industrial scale. There's a number of different ways that alarms and notification systems are represented. And then streamlining workflow and knowledge sharing. And this was a huge one that I'll show you an example of something cool that we made out of that. So what we then created was a new interaction paradigm. And so on the left-hand side, what you can see is the old interaction model, which was an app launcher model, right? So it's basically you go in and you pick which piece of functionality you want, and it opens it up in a new window. And the problem with that is that we would meet with users and they would have like 27 windows open across 4 monitors, and it just gets really cluttered and really confusing really fast. So in the new paradigm, from an interaction perspective, what we did is we created a dashboard, right, where you could open up things like a diagram, so a map. You could have this idea of a work page, which was a new product feature that we created out of the design research for this specific product. And on the right-hand side, the goal was really to start to simplify how users were interacting with the system. So again, if you think about the app launcher model as being all these windows that come up, we wanted to create a place where we could contain the interaction to bring it into a more concise focus for the end user. So what does that start to look like, right? So we start with this high-level interaction strategy. We start to bring that into these high-level views. So you can think about something like a dashboard, a diagram, data tables, forms, and then this idea of work pages. And so this notion of work pages over here on the right-hand side was this simple idea that there's common tasks and common flows that users would need to go through in, say, doing something like taking a factory on and offline to bring it back onto the electrical grid. Or, for example, if there was a storm and there was a power outage, they would have to go through a sequence of steps to restore power to that certain area, right? So there's a number of different workflows that would be high priority that instead of, in the old model where they had this app launcher idea of bringing up all these windows kind of in an ad hoc fashion, we could structure them a little bit so that they had the right information at the right time, and then we could call that a work page where they could get that one task done. And so it starts to look something like this, right? So if we look at the old screens, they were kind of messy, kind of all over the place. There really wasn't much visual sense that could be made out of them from a cohesive perspective. And when we look at the new screens, they start to look like this. So we've got a dashboard with a notification center, maps in the middle. This idea of communication, again, talking to people in the control rooms, we learned that communications, because it's a 24-hour cycle in terms of how power grids are managed, that you can't really just stop doing it. So it has to be managed on a 24-hour shift. So when the next person comes in, they need to know what happened, who was dealing with the problems at that time. So this idea of having these communication channels and a secure chat network inside the organization became really important. I mentioned that this idea, they used to use multiple windows to accomplish one common task. And so when we went doing these contextual inquiries and talking to people, and we saw that when they were doing these tasks, they would position windows like this. So they would have a map. They would have a list of crews. They would be scheduling those crews of when they could actually go fix a problem, right? It's not that uncommon of a pattern, but we saw them repeating this over and over again and popping open these windows and then positioning them in a certain way so that they could look at the map, they could see the crews, and they could see the schedule. And so again, thinking about how we can translate that interaction mess or problem into a product feature, we started to do something like this, where instead of giving them just a random place to start and forcing them to open up multiple windows, we could actually just turn that into a product feature and say, look, crew scheduling is a thing. You have to do it. Everybody has to do it in your role. So why not have the map, the schedule, the crew availability for unassigned jobs in one place and turn that problem into a product feature? And so at the end of the day, what we were able to do is take a footprint that had 11 monitors that let people, again, turn on and off these network switches in the field, take that data, bring it back into the system so that they can make more informed decisions about what's going on in their control room and also what's going on in the field. And we got it down to three monitors, which is great. So I don't know how many of you guys are interaction designers, but it's kind of where my history is. So I also threw this in there. Designing for a multi-monitor environment also has its problems, right? So you can't just think about a regular screen flow going from one screen to the next screen to the next screen because it's not necessarily a linear thing. So we had to come up with solutions like this where we had, right, the product features, the 3 types of workspaces on the top, but instead of going from one screen to the next screen, the user may actually have to work on 3 screens, and then these 2 screens, and then these 2 back to 1, depending on what they were trying to do. So it brought up a whole other range of problems just because of the size of the footprint that we were dealing with. Once we actually started getting some of the screens together, we started setting them up, right? So, and I can't stress this enough, right? So I know print designers, right, when you need to print something, you have to print it to scale so that you know how big it's going to be when it actually gets printed. Like, you want to see how big it is. So for something like this, actually setting up a fake control room so that we can begin to see, like, what is the travel distance of the mouse when somebody has to go from here to here, right? Like, they're moving their wrist actually a really far distance. And if that's critical functionality, you want to make sure that those 2 things are close together. So by getting these screens set up in a faux environment, we could begin to see what some of the problems were with the assumptions that we had made before the system is actually even live, right? Again, this is an example of some of the work pages that were created. So things that you can do right now when approaching connected systems like this and connected products. One, identify meaningful opportunities, because I feel like a lot of what we do, or a lot of the products that are coming out that are connected, are here. And they make the assumption that by giving somebody data, it'll somehow turn into knowledge. And really understanding what it is they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it is really going to move the needle in terms of getting it from data into the more information and knowledge spaces. 2, think about this information lifecycle, right? So it's not just the data coming off of the physically connected thing. You have to do something with that data, right? You have to analyze it, you have to process it, you have to turn it into information, and then make sure that you can affect the future, right? So it's not just taking that data and giving it to the person and assuming that they'll find meaning in it. We want to look for opportunities where you can take that data coming off of that connected product, analyze it, but then affect the person's outcome when they go to use that product in the future. And finally, there's this term that gets tossed around by interaction designers and design researchers, which is know your users. So think about it from their perspective. But the thing that I'm going to add to that tonight is that consider context, because as these products become more highly connected, the context in which they're used becomes more obscure, right? Like you don't know if the person's going to be crossing the road while they're checking their mobile device. This picture is actually a real device that we were asked to design, which is a testing device that they use on welding, right? So if they're building a skyscraper, you have to run a pen along the welds to make sure that the welds are actually secure. And so this guy's out on the side of he's actually on an oil platform in the North Sea, right? And when we started meeting with the product owner, they were like, but wait, where's the strap going to go? And we were like, what are you talking about, the strap? He's like, well, they have the pen and they have to hold on and they're doing this thing. And we're like, what are you talking about? And so context becomes really important because, for example, you don't know if the person is actually going to be using the product, while they're in an elevated situation without their hands free. And this is just one example of where we didn't design that product, we redesigned that product. But the point is that you don't know where the person's going to be when they need to use it. So trying to get your head around where is the context of this product going to be used. And this is just a quote from John Brunner. As these barriers as the barriers are falling, the big machines that I mentioned earlier are going to have impact at a large scale, right? But at a small scale, it's essential to understand, what is it like from the human's perspective so that you can create a meaningful connection to the products and services that you are designing. And so the importance of this, right, is really that there's an inflection point. And so when we think about all of the products and services that I just mentioned earlier, specifically, things like the electrical grid or aviation, kind of these massive problems that are becoming more highly connected. It's super important that you guys, as designers, understand not only the value, but how inherently critical the decisions you make are, because that is the only point of connection in which all this data flows through. So on the left-hand side, you've got things like connected hardware, right? You've got environmental conditions. You've got these goals, these tasks that somebody in the field is trying to accomplish. They often have some domain knowledge, right? And that's all there. On the other side, you've got remote operations. You've got somebody else that's using this piece of software, right? And so there you may have things like historical information, data services, remote collaborations, idea that they can talk across that channel. And the interface and the product that you guys create is ultimately that inflection point between those connected services, right, and the software in which it gets displayed and gets communicated and internalized, right? So as these products and services become more highly connected and more data is traveling through them, it becomes that much more critical, especially if you're dealing with large-scale industrial internet systems. So, and finally, I really feel like companies need us. They need smart designers who are able to think and really consider the point of view of the user more now than ever, because what we're doing is becoming more valuable, and that's partially due to these more highly connected systems. And again, the data is the easy part, but understanding humans is often the hardest part. So the question was, if I could design anything to create a more emotional connection, what would I create? That's a great question. I think that this is going to sound silly, but toys. I think that there's been a lot of consideration given to toys, but I don't think that there's been enough done to really heighten some of the more emotional connections that kids have. There's a lot of electronics, inside of those types of products. There's a high amount of emotional connection to some of those products, but I think that there's probably an opportunity to continue to build on that time-based emotional connection to kids and products. Personally, I haven't done a lot in that space, and maybe that's one of the reasons why it interests me. I think that, a lot of what I do professionally, tends to drift towards these large, complex, systems. So that's one place. Other places where I think that, if I was going to be able to design anything that I wanted, it may be looking at more potentially like a dining experience, right? Or thinking about how we understand, food and things like that, potentially. I think that there's probably an opportunity there, looking at, understanding our relationship to food and the emotional qualities and characteristics we have to food. So what do I think is overrated? Sure. I think that when you hear a lot of people talk about the Internet of Things, it's a lot about data and sensors. And they talk about things largely from an engineering perspective. And they try to look at, you hear them talking a lot about how machine-to-machine communication is going to be arising and how we can take this data and use these data lakes. But I think that if I had to say one thing that's overrated, it's probably the engineering aspect of how it works. Because I think that a lot of what makes the product successful is ultimately that understanding the human, right? So it's trying to understand that emotional quality, that emotional characteristic, but that's not what anybody seems to be talking about, right? Like when you hear a lot of these companies talk about what the industrial internet or what the Internet of Things is, like Cisco and all these, it's the Internet of everything, it seems to be too vague and too broad, right? I do think that GE is making great strides in kind of defining what that means for industry. And if I had to make a guess, I think that we'll see that same definition come around other things as people kind of carve out little areas that they can define more clearly, like what it means and how connectivity will help that aspect of society. So the question, just for you guys in the back, was how are we looking to measure emotional connection? And what types of things are we doing to better understand, how people are emotionally connected to the products that we create? And so the answer is that we don't measure the emotional connection at all, really. We do, as we're creating these products, we do quant analysis, right? So if that's looking at like A/B testing or testing a specific feature of something to see if it's adopted readily. So we do quantifiable testing on specific products. But on the qualitative side, it's often talking to people about what they think and why they think that way. And so while there is no measure that we come in and say, we quantifiably think that somebody is qualitatively here on a spectrum, we do build quant and qual into every exercise and every project that we do. So the question was, how much do I think that product success is related to managing communities? It depends on the product. I mean, if it's a social product, that's obviously like a different thing. I don't think that you necessarily have to manage a community, though, to launch a product successfully. I think that you have to listen to the community. Right, and so in the example earlier when we were talking about quantifiable tests and qualitative tests, we do want to understand from the community's perspective what things they value. And so that's not so much to say that we need to go manage that community, but we definitely have to listen and shift our perspective based on what they say. So if we try something and it doesn't work for this specific group of people, we need to be able to listen to that community and then say, this user group wasn't connecting with that product feature, let's go do this. So I don't think it's the same as managing, but I think that like listening is the more important part. Yeah. So the question was, who are we working for as an agency? Are they product managers, marketing departments? It's a little bit of both. Sometimes it's a marketing department that actually owns a product. Sometimes it's a product owner. It's generally the case, though, that there's a product owner that we're working for directly as a client. Yeah. Occasionally, if there is a new product that's being created, so sometimes there's a product that needs to be revamped because it's no longer relevant to the industry that it sits inside of. In that case, there'll be an existing product owner. Sometimes it's the case that we're working with executives or a board of directors because they're trying to create or trying to find out if there is an opportunity to create a new product in a new space. Right? So sometimes they'll be looking for that opportunity space, trying to create something in the future. And then if there is an opportunity, then they'll work to get a product owner in there. But sometimes if you're working with something that doesn't exist, there may not be that role within the organization on the client side to actually fill it. Good?
Yeah, good.
Okay. Thank you.